The mist remembers your name. Night had come down without haste over the ridgelines and valleys like an old wool blanket spread out by patient hand. It was not a sudden arrival. No one could have pointed to a single instant and said, "This is where night began." First, the brightest shine went out of the sky. Then the blue of day deepened, gentled, and took on that damp hue that comes just before true darkness settles over open land. After that, the air changed. It grew finer, cooler. Began to smell of wet earth, sleeping stone, low herbs still holding a faint warmth of sun in their stems, and distant peat, as if somewhere hidden away someone had stirred a small fire back to life in a low-roofed house. Little by little, almost without the world noticing, the whole landscape slipped into a kind of whisper. The stone walls stretched through the grass like old grey thorns and slowly faded into the half-light. The puddles that had reflected broken clouds at dusk became black mirrors. The low hills rounded by time looked like immense animals sleeping under the mist, and over all of it there spread a delicate stillness, a stillness that was not the absence of life, but a tacit agreement among living things to breathe more slowly. Across that rolling plain walked a man alone. His name was Eamon, his travelling cloak darkened by use and already damp along the hem from the mist rising out of the hollows, brushed the tall stalks with a soft, repeating sound. His boots carried dried mud from other roads. The leather straps he wore were worn thin where shoulder and chest had pressed against them most. In a small satchel at his side he carried a hardened piece of bread, a bruised apple, a knife with an ashwood handle, tinder wrapped in cloth, and a broken comb that had belonged to his mother. He was not a warrior. He was not a lord of lands. He was not a monk nor a court poet. He was one of those men who know many roads and still are not always certain which one belongs to them. He had crossed 2 valleys in 3 days. He had slept in fragments under other people's sheds in the shelter of rock outcrops, once in the hollow of an old ruined hermitage where the damp smell of moss still clung to the cracks around the altar. He had shared a bowl of milk with an old woman who never asked his name. He had accepted silence where silence was offered, and conversation where someone lit a fire at dusk and wished to hear or tell something simple. But that night he was alone again, far from any visible roof, with the last of the light nearly gone and his body worn down by too many days of walking without any precise destination. His weariness had settled into him in a deep and wordless way. It was not only the weight in his feet, or the dull ache in his calves, or the stiffness in his shoulders. It was older than that, broader than that. His thoughts weighed on him too. The memory of a home that no longer sounded the same weighed on him. Entire seasons spent beside his sick mother's bed, hands resting on a blanket, waiting for small improvements that sometimes came and sometimes vanished before dawn, weighed on him. The nights when he had heard her breathing turn fragile weighed on him. The mornings when he had gone out for water, pretending strength so he could return with a calm face, weighed on him. Even the kindness of the neighbors had become a burden, the neighbors who had told him he ought to leave for a while once everything was over. Walk. Let his heart air out, the way a shuttered house is aired at the end of winter by opening doors and windows, even if the cold hurts at first. So he had left, without a true destination, without a promise, with no purpose beyond moving forward until movement put into order whatever was still dark inside him. He had followed cart tracks, sheep paths, passes between hills, the edges of bogland and the banks of small streams where stones shone like wet backs in the morning sun. Sometimes he stopped to listen to water, sometimes to watch the wind comb through the grass, sometimes to look at a crow on a rock, still as an ancient thought. But that night, for the first time since beginning his journey, he felt that he was not merely tired, he was exhausted down to the root. It was an old exhaustion, as if one winter too many had already lived in his bones, as if his hands remembered work his body had never done, as if without asking permission his chest had gathered into itself the fatigue of other wanderers, other sons, other men and women who had kept vigil beside their own, who had buried those they loved, who had gone on because the next day came anyway. It was not a sharp pain, it was not an open wound, it was a low, wide tide that had covered him whole. He stopped beside a large rock, rounded by countless rains and partly covered in white lichens that looked like moon ash clinging to the stone. He laid a hand on its cold surface. Then he looked up. Mist was beginning to rise from the hollows. It did not rise like a wall, it came in fine veils. It first crept along the lowest grasses. Then it wrapped itself around the smaller mounds. Then it spread, soft and persistent, covering the folds of the land until they became secret. Where the ground dipped, the fog looked like pale water. Where it lifted, it looked like breath the hill was exhaling with patience. Farther off, among the shadows of the plain, the heather showed dark as ink. Eamon closed his eyes for a moment. He listened. The world was breathing slowly, the brush of air across the grass, the tiny sound of a drop falling from some leaf. Very distant water, the soft creak of his own clothes as he moved, the tired pulse of blood in his temples, and something else. It was not exactly a sound, not in the way water or wind are heard. It was more a sensation, a wordless summons, a strange delicacy like someone in a dim room drawing back a curtain very slowly to let morning light in without waking anyone. An attention, an invitation, something that did not pull at him but waited for him. He opened his eyes. Ahead of him, where only dark grass, scattered clumps and shapeless shadows had stood an instant before, a path was beginning to take form. It did not appear all at once. First it was only a line slightly denser in the color of the field, then an uncertain curve, then a change in the texture of the ground, as if the landscape were remembering a forgotten trace. And at last, with a clarity that belonged neither entirely to night nor entirely to memory, the purple heather path emerged. Its color was not the bright purple of a flower open under full sun. It was deeper than that, calmer, velvety, as if twilight itself had learned how to bloom. On either side of the path, the heather rose just high enough to brush a traveler's ankles. It was not tall, it did not close the way. It accompanied it. Every branch seemed alive with a peculiar stillness, and though the air remained cool, a faint fragrance of wild honey, warm peat, and rain held in small branches drifted toward him with humble sweetness, like the memory of a summer home. Eamon did not move. A shiver passed through him, but not from fear, from recognition, because he had heard as a child of roads that were not always in the world, paths that obeyed neither maps nor boundary stones nor the ordinary tracks left by cattle. His grandmother, who spun by the fire and knew old songs no one else remembered whole, had told him once, during an autumn storm, that there is a heather path that does not rise from the earth every day. It only appears, she had said while the spindle turned between her fingers, when the soul is so tired that the feet would no longer know, on their own, how to find the place where they may rest. He had listened to that story with the distracted reverence of childhood, half believing it and half simply savoring it the way one savors beautiful things that do not need to be proven. He remembered the low fire, the rain beating on the wood, the smell of barley soup cooling in the pot. He remembered his grandmother's hands crossed with blue veins, moving slowly and exactly. "And where does it lead?" he had asked. "Where it is needed." That is not a place. All true places are. At the time he had frowned, and she had laughed with the low laugh of those who do not hurry to explain. Now, in the middle of the mist and the empty plain, he was not smiling. He pressed a hand to his chest, not to ward off any spell and not to clutch at a symbol, but only to feel his own heartbeat. It was still steady, slower than it had been during the day's walking, heavier, but steady. He looked back. The path by which he had come was already barely visible, only a dark trace broken by shadows and stones. He looked ahead again. The heather path curved gently toward a low hill, as if inviting him to follow without haste, without demand, without loud promises. Then he remembered another part of his grandmother's tale. Do not take it if you are full of pride, nor if you seek it out of greed, nor if you want a shortcut to arrive somewhere sooner. The path is not for the impatient, it is for the spent, for those who have already given all they could give for that day, for that year, or for that sorrow. Eamon let the air out very slowly, and in that breath he felt he was releasing more than the body's fatigue. As if, for one moment, he were laying down the obligation to understand everything. As if he might walk without having to decide first what meaning there was in walking. He took a step. The heather did not crush beneath his boot like ordinary brush. It bent aside with a natural gentleness and rose upright again behind him. The ground was firm, but not hard, soft in places, warm in others, as if beneath it there breathed an older earth than the one worn by carts and flocks. There were no loose stones, no treacherous mud. The path accepted his weight without complaint. He kept walking. The fog accompanied the path, but did not cover it. It stayed to either side like a pale sea respecting its shore. At times it leaned inward as if wanting to touch the heather, then drifted back. At times it wound around a rock or a distant shrub and turned it into a rounder, kinder shadow. At other moments it opened just enough to show fragments of the outer plain, pale and mute, before closing softly again. As he went on, Eamon discovered something strange and deeply consoling. The weariness was still inside him, but it had stopped pressing him downward. It did not vanish, it did not dissolve. No sudden enchantment drove it out. It remained present, real, entire. And yet it no longer felt like an enemy. It was simply something true, something he could finally carry without fighting it. That moved him more than he would have expected, because over the previous days he had tried not to think too much, not to feel too much, not to stop too much, as if his heart were a vessel filled to the brim, and any stillness might make it spill. He had walked so as not to remain still. He had kept going so he would not hear everything lost left behind. But on that path, where the purple heather breathed its quiet perfume and the night seemed to listen without judgment, he no longer needed to act strong. He could be tired, he could have loved so much that now it hurt. He could still not know who he would be after grief. He could walk without an answer. That too was human. That too, he thought, must belong to the secret order of things. The path went on through the gentle rises and dips of the land. To his right appeared an old hawthorn. Twisted by years, its trunk split in two from the base and its branches stretched toward the dark sky like thin fingers. Faded ribbons were tied to its branches. Some nearly vanished into the bark. Others still held a dim trace of blue, red, or white. The wind barely moved them, but when it did, it seemed as though the tree were breathing other people's dreams. Eamon stopped. He did not remember ever hearing of such a hawthorn in that region, and that in itself was strange, because trees marked by offerings tend to remain in the memory of shepherds, herb-gathering women, and children who learn early enough where one ought not shout or break off branches. The strips of cloth were old, some so worn that only threads remained. Others seemed more recent. They did not hang there as decoration. Each one was a petition, a thanks, or a name spoken very softly in some hour of need. He bowed a little, not to pray for any particular thing, but as one greets something venerable. And when he raised his head, he thought he saw a figure on the other side of the tree. A small woman, wrapped in a grey-green mantle. She carried a little basket on her arm. He could not make out her face. only the peaceful outline of a motionless presence. A serenity that imposed no authority and yet seemed to have been keeping that place long before he was born. There was no threat in her, no haste either. She was like another part of the night made visible for a moment. Amon blinked, the figure was gone. Only the hawthorn, only the ribbons, only the fog, only the path. He remained still a moment longer, not because he wanted to verify anything, but because the heart sometimes needs a few extra beats to make room for what it has seen. Then he walked on. With every step, the world seemed to grow more silent, but also fuller, not empty, full of living stillness, as if stories slept beneath the earth, as if old eyes watched without threat from inside the folds of the mist, as if this path had not been made for losing oneself, but for being carried. He remembered other tales from childhood, green burial mounds under which, people said, music still sounded on certain nights of the year, hollow hills where time moved differently, water women combing their hair at dawn with silver combs, invisible processions that left the smell of apple and bluebell in the air. Not all such stories were meant to be followed. Some warned, others taught reverence. But this path, he realized, stirred in him neither dangerous curiosity nor any longing to see more. It stirred rest. After some measure of time he could not name, for their time seemed to have grown less sharp, the hill ahead of him began to rise a little more. On its slope here and there, small soft lights were shining. They were not lanterns, they did not flicker with the irregularity of fire. They were round and delicate like pearls lit among the shrubs. One would disappear, then another would appear a little higher up. They were not frightening. They looked like signs of something hospitable. Eamon slowed. Then he heard a music so distant, it almost seemed remembered rather than heard. A harp, perhaps, or wind passing through an opening in stone and turning into notes. There were very few of them, spaced apart, clear. So calm he had to close his eyes for a moment just to hear them better. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw the kitchen of his childhood, the bench by the fire, the shadow of the loom, the steam of a cup in his mother's hands on a rainy night. He did not see a whole image, only flashes, the way the hearth light gilded the wood, the sound of a spoon against the bowl, a voice humming without realizing it. When he opened his eyes again, the path was still there. The heather brushed his boots, the hill breathed before him. The gentle light still waited, suspended in the mist like moon seeds. He knew with a calm and quiet certainty that that night would not end out in the open. And for the first time in many months, he didn't fear what might be waiting at the end of the road. He felt relief, not the loud relief of someone escaping danger, not the sudden joy of good news, but a humbler, deeper form of relief, the kind felt by someone utterly spent, who discovers there is still a place where he may be allowed to rest without giving explanations. He kept climbing. The path narrowed slightly at the edge of a rise, then opened again. To his left, where the mist drew back for a moment, he thought he could make out a small lake, still as polished as stone, covered in part by an ashen light. To his right, the shadows of old yews formed a natural arch. The air was more fragrant there. It smelled of heather, yes, but also of damp leaves, resin, and a faint sweetness Eamon could not name, as though invisible flowers had opened only for the night. On a flat stone by the way, he saw a robin perched. At that hour it ought to have been impossible, and yet there it was, its breast only faintly suggested in the dimness, round and still. It did not look asleep, nor afraid, only present. It tilted its head toward him once, then again, and then flew off in silence toward the slope. Eamon watched it vanish among the gentle lights of the hill. He He went on. The tiredness in his legs remained, but now each step felt deeper than it felt heavy. He had the strange impression that the path was running not only beneath his feet, but within him as well, joining separated places, skirting sorrows, passing through memories, carrying him with a patience no human companion could have managed without speaking. And so, under the newly made night, among kind mist and purple heather, with the lights coming ever nearer and that remote, peaceful music drifting through the air at intervals, Eamon climbed toward the hill as though he had been expected for a very long time. The slope grew brighter as he rose, though the night did not yield and the sky remained covered by a dark depth without any visible moon. It was not a brightness coming from above, nor a light strong enough to cast sharp shadows on the ground. It seemed to rise from the earth itself, from the wet stones, the low leaves, the small blossoms of heather edging the path. Everything was wrapped in a faint radiance, enough to distinguish the outlines of things, and yet so soft that it did not break the spell of the half-dark. It was a quiet light, a light that did not impose itself, but accompanied, like those kind people who help without noise, so that only later, when one looks back, does one realize how much relief they left behind. Eamon walked even more slowly, as though he feared that too much haste might disturb the rhythm of the place. He did not do so from fear, but from a reverence that rose of itself. There are places where the body understands before the mind what kind of care is expected of it. That hill was one of those places. The purple heather path seemed to demand nothing, and for that very reason it inspired a courtesy deeper than many noble halls or many stone temples. There were no guards, no closed doors, no voice ordering silence. And yet Eamon felt with complete clarity that one ought to speak softly there, breathe slowly, and place one's feet on the ground with gentleness. The lights he had seen from below were not flames nor common fireflies. As he drew nearer, he saw that they hovered just above the grass or rested on the branches of shrubs like round drops of glow. Some were no bigger than hazelnuts, others only a little larger than river pearls. Their color shifted from milky white to the palest gold, like the center of certain flowers at dawn or the sheen of fresh cream on the surface of a cup of milk. They did not move at random, nor did they seem driven by any urgent purpose. They remained there, pulsing softly like small breaths of light. One of them rose slowly as he passed nearby. It lifted to the height of his hand. It did not buzz. It did not crackle. It left no trail in the air. It simply rose with such perfect calm that Eamon felt time itself arranging around it to make room. He raised his fingers without touching it. On his skin he felt the faintest warmth, like the warmth left in a stone that has held the afternoon sun, or in the back of an animal that has slept near the hearth. The light lingered before him for a moment, then drifted away with the easy peace of an insect that does not fear, and settled on a gorse bush covered in dew. There it remained, suspended among the thorns and droplets, until the whole bush seemed adorned with the glow of an ancient and humble celebration. He did not know why, but he smiled. It was a small smile, felt more than seen. The first that had come to him without effort in many days. It did not rise from any thought or sudden joy. It was born of stillness itself. From the simple, astonishing fact of being in a place where nothing seemed to ask of him strength, decision, or composure. Only presence, only true weariness, only that stripped down way of being in the world that remains when one no longer tries to appear more whole than one is. The path kept curving around the hill. At times it ran between low heather, whose sweet earthy scent rose at every brush of air. At times it passed beside rounded rocks covered in moss, their surfaces padded by centuries of fine rain. Some had the shape of old animals lying down. Others looked like tiny altars abandoned by time. Eamon could not have said why, but none of those stones felt mute to him. They seemed to have witnessed innumerable seasons, lost footsteps, half-spoken promises, shared silences between wind and grass. At a bend, he saw 3 young ash trees growing very close together, their roots almost embracing. Between their trunks, someone or something had left a clay bowl. Inside it was very still water, and floating on it were tiny white petals. Not whole flowers, only petals. Small, light, almost translucent. Some had already begun to curl at the edges, as though they had remained there long enough to accept the water as a final bed. Eamon stopped, not out of fear, but out of respect. He had learned since childhood that in certain lands it is wise to look twice before touching a stone, a spring, or a bent branch. Not out of blind superstition, but out of courtesy. There are places, his grandmother used to say, that are inhabited in a different way. Not always by visible beings. Sometimes by memory, sometimes by promise. Sometimes by an old custom of the world that deserves to be treated gently. Not everything sacred rings bells, she had once told him while shelling peas by the door. And not everything invisible is empty. So he inclined his head slightly to the bowl and walked on. The music returned. This time, clearer. Not much clearer, only enough for him to distinguish the sustained vibration of one string. Then another. Then a simple sequence of spaced notes, as though someone were playing to accompany a child's sleep or an invalid's rest. There was no virtuosity in that melody. It did not seek to impress. It was a music made to hold the air, to help it remain soft and hospitable. Each note seemed to linger for a moment between the mist and the heather stalks before dissolving without sadness. Eamon drew a deep breath. The smell of heather was stronger there. So was the smell of earth, not the turned earth of fields or the hard earth of dry roads, but that hill earth that smells of old roots, of leaves dampened again and again, of rain stored between layers of dark peat. Beneath it lay another scent, fainter, almost domestic, something like the smoke of very clean firewood, very far away. As if somewhere beyond the next bend or behind a large stone there were a hearth already burning. Not the harsh smoke of a hurried fire, nor the sour smell of a badly aired house, but the light and comforting perfume of a chimney tended by patient hands. The mere possibility of a sheltered fire, though he did not yet know whether it was real, loosened his shoulders a little. He had not realized until then how tightly he had been holding them, lifted and tense, as if even in the middle of silence, his body were still waiting for one more demand. A long road teaches many things, and one of them is not to take rest for granted. That was why that scent, so faint that in another state of mind he might have missed it, struck him almost as an act of mercy. Not because it promised abundance, but because it hinted at refuge. He climbed a few more steps and the path opened. Before him lay a small plateau, rounded at the crest of the hill. It was not large. On one side stood an incomplete ring of ancient stones, some upright, others laid down by time in the grass. They were not as tall as the great monoliths of legend, but they kept a peaceful dignity. Their surfaces, veined with lichen and damp, gave off that soft brightness old things take on at night when no one looks at them in haste. Fine grass grew among them, and here and there little clusters of pale flowers seemed to have risen under the shelter of those venerable ruins. Eamon stood for a long moment looking at the circle before taking another step. He did not need anyone to tell him that place had once mattered. He felt it, not through grandeur or splendor, but through endurance. Those stones had stood there long before there were known roads between those hills. They had watched winters so ancient that no living name could remember them. And yet they did not impose themselves. They kept. That was the word that came to Eamon's mind. They kept the air. They kept the silence. They kept, perhaps in some way he did not understand, a promise made between the earth and those who had learned to listen to it. At the center of that rise, sheltered by the ring of stone and by two twisted rowan trees, there was a house. Eamon stood still. It was not a grand manor nor a miserable hut. It was a low white house with rounded corners, a thatched roof darkened by years, and a stone chimney from which rose a thin thread of smoke, almost blue in the muffled brightness of the hill. The door was dark wood with a simple iron latch. Two small windows shone with warm light behind the linen curtains. The house seemed to have grown out of the hill rather than been built upon it. As if the ancient stones, the heather, the fog, and the smoke all belonged to the same silent agreement. Everything about that house looked old and cared for. There was no fence, no dog, no sound of voices, no clatter of utensils, no hurried footsteps, no muffled laughter. Only that light, that smoke, that distant music which perhaps came from within and perhaps from some invisible place nearby, and the deep sensation that the house had not been found by chance, but offered. Eamon remained a moment at the edge of the plateau, letting the vision settle inside him. He felt a small knot in his throat, not from sorrow this time, but from a gratitude so sudden it almost hurt. He could not remember the last time an unknown house had stirred in him, that mixture of rest and welcome before he had even crossed its threshold. With unexpected tenderness, he remembered the way his mother used to light the lamp at dusk in the longest winters. It was never a rich house. It had never been one. But she had the gift of making a single light seem enough against the immensity of night. That house on the hill with its lit windows and its thin thread of smoke gave him the same feeling. Not luxury, shelter. A light gust stirred the heather at his feet. The little lights scattered through the grass seemed to gather almost imperceptibly to one side of the path, as though clearing his final way to the door. He moved forward. The closer he came, the more details emerged from the dimness. Beside one of the windows hung bundles of drying herbs. He recognized yarrow, white heather, vervain, and rowan branches with berries already dark. He also saw wild mint and small yellow flowers tied upside down with red thread. Beneath the eaves stood a small bench of worn wood, smoothed by years of use and many rains. Near the door rested a copper bucket filled with water, and set upside down upon it was a cup, so it would not gather dew. On a flat stone at the threshold, someone had left 3 hazelnuts and a yellow flower with exceedingly fine petals. It did not look like a solemn offering. It looked like a custom, and in some way that made the place kinder still. Solemnity can create distance. Customs draw things close. Seeing those hazelnuts, that simple flower, that cup placed carefully over the bucket, brought Eamon a deep calm. They were signs of an attended life, of a hand that repeated small gestures with affection, of a daily order in which each thing had its place without rigidity. And perhaps that was what moved him most. After so much wandering without belonging anywhere, to find himself before a house where even simplicity had been cared for felt like a gift, difficult to measure. Eamon stepped up onto the stone threshold and stood before the door. He hesitated only for an instant, not because he sensed danger, but because doors, even kindly ones, always mark a crossing. Behind him lay the heather path, the mist, the open air, the long exhaustion carried alone. Ahead there might be rest, or an answer, or a new form of silence. He thought of knocking, but before he could do so, the door opened inward with a noiseless movement, as though whoever stood on the other side had known the exact moment he would arrive. In the doorway stood an old woman. She was very small, with a back only slightly bent and long hair both white and grey, gathered into a braid that fell over one shoulder. She wore a moss-coloured wool dress and a brown shawl. Her hands were fine, the knuckles pronounced. Her eyes, on the other hand, seemed extraordinarily young, Not from lively sparkle or mischief, but from a clear, serene brightness, like spring water never muddied by time. Her face was deeply lined, but held no hardness. The lines around her mouth seemed drawn more by the habit of patience than by pain. She did not look surprised to see him. She did not study him with suspicion. She simply opened the door a little wider and said, in a low voice that seemed made not to disturb anyone's rest, "It is about time you arrived." Eamon took a moment to answer, not because he felt any danger, but because that tone, so natural, stirred something strange in him. It was the voice with which one receives someone expected at the end of a very long day. Not too warm lest it overwhelm, not too distant, just right. The kind of voice that does not first ask where you have come from, what you carry, or whether you can pay, but whether you need to sit down. "I did not know I was coming here," he said at last. The old woman inclined her head with gentle patience. "Sometimes the feet knows something before the tongue does." She stepped aside from the threshold. "Come in. The air on the hill is good, but not better than a bench by the fire once weariness has said its name." Eamon entered. The warmth reached him first in his hands and face, then in his chest. It was not stifling heat, nor the sharp heat of a high flame. It was the steady warmth of a well-kept hearth. A single room opened before him, ample without excess, with dark beams overhead and whitewashed walls that reflected the firelight. In the hearth burned ash logs and peat. From an iron pot hanging above it rose a delicious smell. Barley, leeks, perhaps turnip root, perhaps a few thyme leaves. For a moment, Eamon did nothing but stand there. The simple act of crossing that threshold and feeling the tempered air, the smell of broth, and the murmur of the fire was almost too much for a body that had spent days sleeping in fragments, eating when it could and sheltering wherever it found cover. The whole room seemed designed to soothe. There was a wooden table scarred by use, 2 stools, a chest against the wall, and several shelves holding clay bowls, greenish glass bottles, skeins of thread, baskets, and small objects he could not at first name. Bundles of herbs were hanging from the ceiling to dry. He recognized wild lavender, mugwort, mint, and other plants less familiar to him. In a corner, resting on a chair, was a small harp, so the music had come from there. Though no one was playing it at that moment, the instrument still seemed surrounded by the memory of its notes, as if the wood were holding the echo of fingers that had brushed it only a little while before. The old woman closed the door, and the outer murmur of the mist remained behind, though not entirely. It could still be sensed, muffled like a very distant sea. "Set down your bag wherever it weighs least on you," she said, "and your boots too, if you like. Mud is no enemy in this house, but your feet will be grateful for the rest." Eamon obeyed without protest. He slipped the satchel from his shoulder and left it beside the bench near the fire. Then, after only a brief hesitation, he unlaced his boots. The relief was so immediate he had to steady himself with one hand against the wall. The old woman pretended not to notice, perhaps out of delicacy, perhaps because she understood too well what it meant. She pointed to a low stool by the hearth. "Sit." He sat. Warmth rose from the embers and settled gradually into his tired legs. He felt the numbness in his toes begin to fade. A mild sting ran through his ankles as blood moved again without the pressure of the boots, but even that small pain was comforting. It was the body remembering that it could still loosen. The old woman took a small glazed clay jug, poured a steaming infusion into a cup, and handed it to him. "It is not too hot," she said. "A drink for arriving, not for hurrying." Eamon received it with both hands. It smelled of honey, mint, and something deeper, perhaps rosehip or elderflower. He took a sip. The liquid was gentle, a little sweet, and left a clean warmth in his mouth. He felt it travel slowly down his throat, through his chest, into some interior place where weariness had knotted itself. For a while they did not speak. It was not an uncomfortable silence. The old woman stirred the pot on the hearth, added a sprig of something fragrant, adjusted a log that had tilted to one side. Eamon drank slowly, feeling each sip loosen a different knot inside him. The house creaked here and there with those small sounds lived-in houses make. A beam settling, the discreet simmer of broth, the light brush of dried herbs moving in warm air. On the opposite wall, the firelight trembled softly and turned the shadows of the hanging bundles into a dance. At last, the woman sat on the other stool and looked at him calmly. "Your name is Eamon." It was not a question. He lifted his eyes. He might have felt alarm, but he did not. Only a quiet wonder. "Yes." "And you came from the south of the hills by the old broken causeway and then along the edge of the bog?" It took him a moment to nod. "Yes." "You have slept badly. You have eaten less than you should. You have spoken kindly to those who gave you shelter and with too much severity to yourself." He lowered his eyes to the cup. He did not feel invaded. Strangely, he felt seen. The old woman took one of the hazelnuts from a bowl on the table, cracked it with her fingers, and smiled very faintly. "I do not perform marvels, boy. The heather path brings with it a certain murmur. The house listens. That is all." A broken breath escaped Eamon that was almost a laugh. "In that case, the house knows too much. Old houses hear better than people do. They interrupt less." That answer, given with complete simplicity, made him smile for real. The old woman seemed satisfied by that. She leaned a little toward the fire, stretching her hands to its warmth. "The path appears only when it is needed. Not always for grief, not always for sickness, sometimes for an old weariness, sometimes because someone has carried too many things alone for too long and is beginning to forget that they too were made for rest." Eamon looked at the flames. He did not have the strength to pretend lightness. "I did not want to forget my mother," he said, almost in a whisper. "I was afraid that if I rested, if I stopped thinking of her every moment, something in her would go out completely." The old woman took a little time before answering, not from doubt, rather like someone letting the truth sit down before adding another beside it. "Rest does not put out those we love," she said at last. "Weariness can. It makes everything blurred, dull. It makes us remember only the final stretch of things. The illness, the vigil, the loss. And then we begin to think that loving means never letting go of the weight, but it does not." Eamon tightened his hands around the cup. The fire drew soft shadows on the wall. One of the hanging herbs released in the warmth a fresh fragrance that briefly reminded him of his mother's garden in spring. He saw her for an instant, not in bed and not weakened, but bending over clay pots, brushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist while checking on chive shoots. The memory was so simple and so vivid that a sweet pang went through his chest. "I do not know how to do that," he admitted. The old woman nodded as if he had just named something very common and very worthy. "Almost no one knows the first time. That is what certain paths are for." She rose carefully and went to the pot. She ladled some broth into a deep bowl and set it on the table so it could cool a little. Then she cut a thick slice of dark bread and held it near the fire for a few moments. She did everything without haste and without exaggerated slowness, with an exact rhythm as if each movement had its natural place. "Eat when you feel like it," she said. "After that you will sleep. And tomorrow, if morning comes here the way it usually does, perhaps we will take a walk on the other side of the hill." "The other side?" She looked at him with something almost playful in her eyes. "Every true hill has more than one side, even when from below it looks round. The sentence explained nothing, but did not need to. Eamon drank the rest of the infusion and set the cup down beside the stool. The weariness that had become bearable on the path was beginning now to unfold in all its magnitude. Not as a threat, but as a warm tide finally finding a place to rest. His eyelids grew heavy, his hands loose, his chest less tightly bound. The old woman must have noticed. "There is a short but honorable bed behind that curtain," she said, pointing to a thick cream-colored hanging in the corner opposite the hearth. "Clean wool blankets, a basin with water. No one will ask conversation of you tonight." Eamon wanted to thank her, but the words came slowly, thickened by tiredness and by a peaceful emotion that did not yet have a name. "I do not know who you are," he said, rising with gentle effort, "but—" She lifted a hand, stopping him kindly. "Tonight there is no need. There may be time for names, or there may not. Either can be all right." He nodded. He took the bowl of broth and ate several slow spoonfuls standing beside the table. It was delicious in the humble way meals are when they are made to return the body to itself. The taste of root, grain, just enough salt, something green and fresh added at the end. Then he left the bread half finished, too overcome for more, and passed through the curtain. Behind it he found a small, carefully tended space. A narrow bed with a wool mattress and thick blankets, a chair, a clay basin, a tiny window, almost a slit, through which came the pale brightness of the hill. He washed his hands and face. The water was cool. When he dried himself with a clean cloth, he caught the faint scent of lavender. He lay down. The bed gave slightly under his weight, just enough to receive him without swallowing him. He heard the crackle of the fire on the other side of the curtain, the soft rustle of the old woman moving calmly through the main room. One or two very low notes from the harp, nearly murmured, then nothing but the breathing of the house. Eamon let his head sink into the pillow, and before sleep took him fully, he thought of the purple heather path vanishing behind him in the night, perhaps fading from the hillside for all those who had no need of it. He thought of the little lights among the grass, of the hawthorn with its ribbons, of his grandmother's voice telling stories by the fire, and for the first time since his mother's death, sleep did not come like a clumsy fall or a formless collapse of exhaustion. It came like a soft hand resting on his forehead. It held him, it carried him, and in the quiet depth of that rest, while the house breathed and the hill kept its secret under the mist, he began to dream of a valley he did not remember ever seeing, and yet that felt as familiar as if it had been waiting for him since before he was born. In the dream, the valley opened under a light that seemed to belong neither to dawn nor to dusk. It was not the rosy clarity of a newborn morning, nor the slanting gold of evening when the day begins to gather itself in. It was something else. A serene light spread like fine cloth over the grass, over the gentle slopes, over the slow water of a river that ran through the middle like a ribbon of pale tin. There was no visible sun, no hard shadow either. Everything was touched by an equal kindly brightness, as if the air itself had learned to shine without growing tired. In that light, things did not seem made to be seen in haste. Every tuft of grass had its peaceful outline. Every stone rested in its place with simple dignity. The rushes by the water bent only slightly, and that slight movement was enough to remind him that even in the dream wind still existed, though there it blew without urgency, without cold, without the roughness the waking world sometimes carries. It was a wind that passed the way beloved hands pass over a rumpled blanket, smoothing without imposing. Eamon walked along a barely marked path through tall meadows. He did not feel the weight of his boots or the pull in his shoulders. He walked with the lightness of one who has forgotten nothing and yet no longer needs to carry it. On either side of the way grew bluebells, white clover, tall foxgloves and little yellow stars that folded shut when a very thin cloud passed over the valley. There were low daisies too, scattered like drops of milk in the grass, and tufts of pale heather that did not form a path, yet seemed to greet him as he passed. The wind moved everything slowly, making long, soft ripples like the breathing of the earth. In the distance, bells sounded. Not many, 2 or 3 perhaps, spaced out, sunk so deeply into distance that they became almost another form of silence. Closer by, on some unseen branch, a blackbird tried out a few short notes and then fell quiet, satisfied to have placed a small brightness in the suspended morning of the dream. The river, as it slipped on, did not murmur like a restless stream or a current searching for release. It sounded like water that has known its way for a very long time and feels no hurry to arrive anywhere. Eamon knew that landscape and did not know it. It was the same feeling as with certain old melodies. To hear them once is enough to feel they have always been waiting somewhere, in memory. The river curved where his heart expected it to. The hills lifted where he felt they should be. Even the larger stones lying by the water or half sunk in the grass seemed to obey some intimate order he had carried inside him long before understanding it. He could not have said whether he was remembering a place seen in childhood, a place dreamed before and lost upon waking, or a part of the world that can only be reached when rest opens doors wakefulness cannot find. He went on until he saw a bridge. It was a small bridge, a single arch of stone, covered in parts with moss and low flowers. It had no rails, only the gentle back of stone, polished by countless steps and ancient rain. The moss grew in the joints with an almost velvety softness. At the sides of the arch, small white flowers and bright round leaves pushed from the cracks as though drinking straight from the river's dampness. Below, the water made no sound of torrent or haste. It ran slowly enough to reflect the reeds on the bank, the pale clouds, and at moments Eamon's own face, though the reflection broke at once into soft folds. He stopped in the middle of the bridge. He rested his hands on the cool, damp stone and looked down at the water. A peace so great came over him that for a moment he believed if he stayed there long enough he might forget the name of pain. Not because pain had not existed, nor because true peace must erase what wounds, but because in that valley everything seemed to occupy the exact place that belonged to it. Loss, memory, weariness, love, nothing struggled against anything else. Each thing rested beside the others, like stones well settled in an old wall. He remained there a long while, or whatever in a dream amounted to a long while. He saw a yellow leaf drift past, though he did not know from what tree it could have fallen, for the nearby trees showed no sign of autumn. The leaf spun once, brushed the surface, and went on downstream as if obeying a silent music. A small fish flashed beneath the water and vanished into the green shadows below. On the opposite bank, the taller grass suddenly bent, as if someone had just risen from it. Then he saw someone. She did not appear all at once. First, she was only a figure in the brightness of the meadow. Then the movement of a simple skirt, the profile of hands busy gathering something among the grasses. Then she stood, and he knew her. It was his mother. She was not as he had seen her in her final months, weakened, her face sharpened by illness. Nor was she as young as in his earliest memories, when he barely came to her waist and looked at her as if no force in the world could tire her. She was herself in a calm and steady age, still strong, cheeks touched by the air, hair gathered in that practical way she always wore when working, and a tranquil expression as if she had been waiting for him without impatience. She wore a simple soft wool dress of pale grey with a brown apron, and her sleeves were rolled to her forearms as though she had interrupted a domestic task or some gathering in the garden merely to receive him. Eamon did not speak. He did not even cry. He felt his whole being become silence in order to see her better. In one hand she held a small bundle of herbs or flowers. With the other she brushed a loose strand from her temple. It was such a familiar, holy, hers kind of gesture that Eamon's heart opened with a painful sweetness. He took a step toward her, then another, and as he came off the bridge he felt the strange comfort of realizing there was no fear in that meeting, no shock, no anguish at dreaming something too beautiful and waking broken. Only an immense calm, like the calm that comes before certain benevolent summer rains. His mother smiled, not a bright or festive smile, a home smile, the smile of newly cut bread, of hands setting a blanket across someone's shoulders. The smile with which she had so often looked at him when he came in soaked from the fields, or entered late, tired and hungry, or sat at the table trying to seem older than he was. That smile that did not impose itself and yet had the power to make any room habitable. "You took your time," she said. The voice was exactly hers, not a copy, not a dream voice made of incomplete memory. Truly hers, with that low warmth and slight rasp of someone who had spoken much beside the fire, sung under her breath while working, and laughed more than once with flour on her hands. Eamon bowed his head with a brief laugh, wet and unbelieving. "I have heard that more than once tonight." She came toward him slowly. She did not seem to walk over the grass so much as move with it. When she stood before him, she lifted her hand and touched his cheek the way she used to when she wanted to know whether he had fever or sorrow. The touch was real in the dream, light, warm, more real than many things in waking life. Eamon closed his eyes for a moment to hold it better, as one bends over the embers of a house and lets the heat touch the face. "You are tired," she said. He wanted to answer something dignified, something whole. He wanted to say he was better, that he had endured, that he could still keep walking. But in the presence of that voice and that hand, the barest truth was the only one he could find. Very. His mother nodded, as if that were enough, as if there were no need to embellish fatigue once one had come to a place where it could be named without shame. They walked together beside the river. He did not ask how it was possible. In deep dreams, some quiet part of him thought, true things do not need explanation. They went slowly. The water touched the stones with a soft murmur. In some stretches, rushes grew. In others, pale irises bent their heads over the current. There were clumps of wild mint, too, and when the air brushed them, it carried a clean freshness mingled with the smell of water. A distant flock grazed on a slope so serene it seemed painted onto the air. Higher up stood a few small willows with flexible branches, and among them flickered very faint lights like those on the hill where Eamon slept. Though here they were softer still, as if they wished only to remind him that mystery can accompany without unsettling. "You were afraid you would forget me," she said after a while. Eamon pressed his lips together. "Yes." His mother did not rebuke him. She did not pity him. She only kept walking a little farther before speaking, as if she knew certain words need to go some distance beside the one who hears them before entering the heart. "The exhausted confuse many things," she said. "They confuse silence with forgetting. They confuse rest with abandonment. They confuse going on living with turning their back." He looked at the river. "I did not want everything you were to grow small." She smiled with that blend of tenderness and firmness she had always had. "My son, the small does not become great by being carried like a stone in the chest. And the great does not become small because you let it breathe." The breeze moved a few loose strands of her hair around her face. The valley smelled of clover, clear water, and green apple. Eamon swallowed. "I do not know how to remember without pain." "Not yet." There was no harshness in the answer, only a patient promise. They walked on. On one side of the river stretched a low meadow seeded with tiny flowers. On the other, the ground rose slightly and was covered in ferns open like green hands. Eamon watched his mother brush certain plants as she passed, not to pluck them, but as one greets a garden or checks the state of a leaf with fingertips. It was such a characteristically hers gesture that the entire dream seemed to root itself more firmly around him. Yes, it was her. Not some kindly figure bearing her face, not a merciful invention of rest. Her in the way she tilted her head to look at something small, in the way she kept silence without discomfort, in the way she seemed to know in advance when a conversation needed a pause. "I have tried to keep walking," Eamon said after a time. "I thought moving would help. And it has helped." He frowned faintly. "It does not seem so. You have come this far." He did not answer, because suddenly he understood she was right. He had walked out of sheer exhaustion, out of not knowing what else to do, out of feeling that the stillness of the empty house weighed more than any road. And yet that aimless walking had brought him to the plain, to the mist, to the purple heather, to the hill, and to the dream in which she now walked beside him. Perhaps steps do not always know where they are going while we are taking them. "Sometimes," his mother went on, "one does not walk to find an answer. One walks to soften enough to be able to receive it." The words settled into him with the same softness as the valley's light. Then they came to a low apple tree, heavy with small golden fruit. Beneath it was a stone bench covered with moss dried under that timeless brightness. The tree was not large, but it spread its branches generously, making a round and peaceful shelter. Several apples had already fallen to the ground and gave off a sweet, fresh, almost honeyed scent. A single slow bee lingered on a split fruit without any sign of hurry. They sat down. His mother laid her bundle of herbs beside her. Eamon recognized mint, yarrow, a sprig of rosemary, and tiny white flowers he could not name. Their fragrance rose between them like the memory of kitchen and garden. He closed his eyes for a moment. At once he remembered a late summer afternoon many years before, when she had hung similar bunches from a beam to dry. He had asked what each one was for, and she had answered something different for every plant, as if each had its own nature. One for the chest, another for bad dreams, another for broth, another for days when the world seemed too rough. "I have thought so much these last days," he murmured, "that my head feels like a room full of broken chairs." She let out a low laugh, the same laugh she had when something struck her as exaggerated and exact at once. "Then let the windows in." Eamon looked at her. "That makes no sense." "Not everything that heals begins by making sense." She took one of his hands between both of hers. Her fingers were warm, firm. "Listen to me well. You have not lost me in the way you think. You have lost my voice in the house, my step, my chair by the fire, the way I folded cloths and set water to boil. Yes, and that hurts because those things were part of your days. But I am not only in the ending, I am not only in the illness, I am not only where you watched me leave." Eamon felt his chest tighten again, though not with the same despair as before. It was a tightening that made room. Then where? She lifted her gaze toward the valley. The river from there looked like a pale seam sewn through the meadows. In everything that taught you tenderness, in the way you look at someone who is tired, in the way you know when bread needs a damp cloth, in the way you listen to the rain before sleeping, in the way you name plants, in the way you lower your voice when someone suffers. I am there too. The river went on flowing. A robin landed on a low branch of the apple tree, puffed its breast and gave a brief song. Then it stayed still, as if listening too. Eamon felt something inside him, something old and hard, begin at last to loosen. Not all at once. Not like a dry branch breaking, more like a knot in a rope easing after carrying weight for too long. Since his mother's death, he had believed that remembering meant holding everything very tightly, allowing nothing to move, not letting grief change shape for fear that love might change shape with it. But there beneath the apple tree, with the river nearby and the herbs breathing their scent between them, he understood that love did not need that rigidity to remain true. "I remember mostly the end," he said, almost ashamed. "The cold cloths, the sleepless nights, the way you looked at the window when you could no longer get up. And afterward I feel guilty for not remembering all the rest better." She squeezed his hand. "Because you are tired. Weariness narrows memory, forces it through a doorway too tight. But houses have more than one entrance." Eamon looked up at her. "And how do you open the other one?" His mother smiled faintly. "With rest, with patience, with small things. Learning to remember again without demanding, letting a scent, a song, a cup, a rain shower return what belongs to it." They sat in silence for a while. The robin hopped down and pecked at a blade of grass. Farther away, a very thin cloud crossed the valley's light, and everything turned, for a moment, more silvery. Eamon looked at his mother's hands resting over his own. He remembered those hands, kneading bread, sewing hems, holding the back of his neck when he was a feverish child. He also remembered something very small, the habit she had of tapping apples with a knuckle to know whether they were ready. He had never thought of it as an important memory, and yet in that moment it seemed as precious as any grand scene in a life. Perhaps memory, he understood, is made more of habits than of solemn moments. "I do not know what I will do when I go back," he said at last. "You will go back step by step just as you came. The house will be empty." "Yes." The answer was so simple it helped him breathe. There was no false promise that the emptiness would not hurt. No easy comfort. "But not every empty house is uninhabited," she added after a moment. "Sometimes it only needs someone to light its corners again." Eamon listened to the water. "I'm afraid of walking in and feeling I no longer belong there." She tilted her head as she used to do when one of his worries seemed understandable and yet not final. "Houses learn to wait for us too, especially the ones that have been loved." He lowered his gaze. An apple lying by his foot had a blush-colored patch on its skin. He picked it up. It was warm, as though the light without origin had warmed it. He held it without biting it. "I have been angry," he confessed. "Not with anyone in particular, just angry that the world kept going, that things still need water, bread, firewood, even when someone is gone." His mother nodded. "That too is weariness and grief. Grief grows angry when it discovers the next day comes anyway. It feels like a betrayal. Sometimes it does, but it is not. It is life's way of leaving a chair set for you even when you do not yet want to sit." The image was so clear that Eamon almost smiled. A chair set. Not an obligation, not a command, simply a place kept for him within the continuing world. He did not know how long they remained there. In deep dreams, time does not advance. It rests. At moments they spoke, at moments they did not. She told him, or perhaps he remembered through her voice, about the summer when he got lost among ferns and returned with blackberry-stained hands. She reminded him of the year of long rains when they had moved buckets all over the kitchen to catch the leaks. She recalled the name of a gentle cow he had loved as a child and had nearly forgotten. She reminded him too of a winter of hard frosts when he had tried to save herbs in the garden by covering them with an old blanket, convinced the cold could not reach them that way. At the time, she had not laughed at him, only helped him. Now, remembering it, they both smiled. Each memory came clean, without illness casting its shadow at the end. And Eamon understood with quiet gratitude that this too was a form of healing, giving memory back its full rooms. At last his mother rose. There was no abruptness in the movement, but something in the air told Eamon the dream was beginning to lean toward its end. A small, clear pang of fear went through him. He did not want the valley to dissolve. He did not want to lose again that voice, those hands, the serenity with which everything had been said. "I do not want to wake yet." She looked at him with all the patience in the world. "You will wake all the same, but you will not return empty-handed." She bent and kissed his forehead. The touch was so soft it was almost weightless, and yet it passed through the whole dream like a very distant bell whose vibration remains long after the sound. "When you see heather, pause for a moment," she said. "When you hear water, listen well. When weariness tightens your chest, remember that not every road is walked outward. Some lead back to the part of yourself that knows how to rest." The valley began to grow clearer, not brighter, but finer. Like cloth, the light passes through before it disappears. The robin rose into the air. The river became a strip of pale silver. The flowers seemed to lose their weight as though they were made of breath rather than stem. His mother's figure remained distinct for one moment more, long enough for Eamon to keep the outline of her smile, the calm curve of her shoulders, and the shape of her hands. "Go in peace," she said. "There is still morning for you." Then the valley opened the way water opens when something rises from below, and Eamon felt himself lifting slowly and gently toward waking, carrying with him the smell of herbs, the murmur of the river, and a peace that did not erase grief, but made it livable. He woke slowly as though returning from a very distant shore, and the body had to remember, one part after another, how to inhabit itself again. First he felt warmth. Not an intense warmth, but warmth carefully kept. The kind held by wool blankets that have retained the rest of the night. The kind that belongs to a small room that has not fully let the dawn chill in. The kind of his own body, finally surrendered to sleep without struggle. Then he noticed the pillow beneath his cheek, the rough softness of the fabric beneath his hand, the quiet weight of his legs resting into the mattress. Only then did he open his eyes. The light beyond the curtain was not bright. It came filtered and milky, as if morning had climbed the hill barefoot, unwilling to wake anyone too suddenly. Eamon remained still for a moment, breathing slowly and deeply in a way that did not resemble the tired waking of the previous days. He listened. The house was still alive with small sounds. The faint crackle of embers not yet gone out. The scrape of wood against clay. Perhaps a spoon laid down with care. A murmur so soft it might have been a melody without words, or merely the habit of someone used to accompanying herself in her work. And beneath everything, a full round quiet, so different from the hollow silence of houses from which someone is missing that Eamon had to close his eyes again just to feel it better. The dream was still with him, not as an exact image, nor as one of those night memories that unravel when grasped at, but as a delicate fragrance clinging to the heart. He still held the valley, the bridge, the apple tree, his mother's voice saying he would not return empty-handed. He did not doubt what he had lived, nor did he feel any need to test it. Some things, on waking, ask to be analyzed. Others ask for gratitude. This belonged to the second kind. He moved one hand across the blanket. His fingertips touched something beneath it. Something small and vegetal, dry but flexible. He sat up slowly and folded back the wool. On the pillow beside the place where his temple had rested lay a sprig of mint, a tiny white flower, and a strand of purple heather. Eamon looked at them for a long time. It was not a bouquet, not a casual decoration. They had been placed with the same simplicity with which someone leaves a bowl of water for the thirsty traveler who arrives. The mint lifted its scent faintly when he touched it. Fresh, clean. The little white flower felt familiar, though he did not know its name, but the heather he recognized at once. A tiny violet spike, velvety, almost identical to those that had brushed his boots on the night path. He placed it in his palm. A strange and gentle feeling came over him, as if dream and waking had clasped hands for a moment to assure him that not every comfort is imagined. He sat on the edge of the bed. His body answered him differently than it had on so many recent mornings. He was still tired, yes, but the weariness was no longer a shapeless weight spilled everywhere. It had become local, concrete, almost honorable. A small ache in the back, a slight stiffness in the ankles, the natural heaviness of muscles after deep sleep. None of that diffuse oppression that on previous days had tightened his chest even before he stood up. He washed his face in the basin's cold, clear water. The cloth smelled of lavender and of sun stored away. Then he pushed the curtain aside and stepped into the main room. The old woman was by the table, slicing bread. Morning light entered through the small window and mingled with the low glow of the hearth, where live embers still glowed under a skin of bright ash. On the table sat a bowl of oat porridge, honey in a little jug, a soft cheese wrapped in cloth, and brown apples with mat skins. There was also an earthen teapot, letting off a faint steam scented with blackberry leaves and something citrus he could not identify. The old woman lifted her eyes as if she had known the exact instant he would emerge from behind the curtain. "You have slept with true weight," she said. It was not a question. Eamon nodded. "Yes." Then he hesitated and added, "I dreamed." The old woman smiled with an expression so slight it barely reached the corners of her mouth. Of course, she did not ask for details. She did not seem surprised, and that absence of intrusive curiosity struck Eamon as deeply kind. There are people who, faced with such a dream, would want to know every part of it. She seemed to understand that some things enter the world better if they first sit down at a table and eat something warm. "Come," she said. "Porridge does not take offense easily, but it is better when tended in time." Eamon came to the table. The house smelled of simple breakfast, warm wood, and dried herbs warmed by the air of the hearth. He sat on the same stool as the night before. The old woman served the porridge into a deep bowl, added a spoonful of honey, and set a few cracked walnuts beside it. Eamon had not remembered being hungry until the bowl stood before him. Then hunger arrived, deep and quiet the way water returns to parched ground. He ate slowly. The porridge was creamy, with that humble texture that does not try to impress anyone and yet comforts. The honey had a floral undertone, perhaps heather or hawthorn. The walnuts crunched with a round, earthy taste. While he ate, the old woman poured tea into a cup and sat across from him. They did not speak much. There was no need. From time to time, she looked at him sidelong, not to examine him, but with the serene attention of someone watching color return to tired cheeks. After a while, Eamon opened his hand and took out the mint, sprig, the flower, and the heather. He had carried them with him without realizing it. He placed them carefully on the table. They were on my pillow. The old woman let her eyes rest on the 3 tiny stems. "Yes." "Did you leave them there?" She took a sip of tea before answering. "The house helps. I accompany." It was one of her answers, simple and mysterious at once, as though she did not make much distinction between those 2 states. Eamon looked again at the heather. "I saw my mother." The old woman showed no surprise. "You believe that now because it is true." He looked at her for a long moment. "In another place," said in another voice, those words might have sounded theatrical or presumptuous. In hers, they sounded as simple as a weather truth. They spoke little more of the dream then. Morning belonged first to food, to warmth, to the body settling back into itself. Only later, when the bowls were nearly empty and the tea had gone mild, did the old woman rise and say, "Put on your boots. We will go see the other side of the hill." She took a light grey mantle from a peg by the door and draped it over her shoulders. Then she pointed to Eamon's boots, now cleaned of the dried mud from the day before. "Put them on. We will not go far, but distance is not always measured in steps." He obeyed. As he tightened the boots, he felt again how much his body had changed after only one night. His joints were still tender, but no longer protested as though every movement were a debt. He settled his cloak over his shoulders. Before stepping outside, he looked once around the room. The bench by the fire, the harp in its corner, the herbs hanging from the beams, the cup upside down on the bucket by the door. Everything seemed so real, so ordinary, that a part of him wondered whether, once back in his own world of roads and villages, the house would seem too perfect to have existed. But the smell of peat, the faint prickle of wool at his neck, and the tangible memory of breakfast denied any such doubt. The old woman opened the door. The hill's morning received them like a cool exhalation. The night mist had not vanished entirely. It had lifted a little, forming higher veils through which the earth rose and disappeared gently. The heather shone with drops of dew. The small lights that had escorted Eamon up the slope in the night were gone, or perhaps merely made invisible by daylight. The ring of stones was still there, peaceful and ancient. Beyond it, the slope descended in pale undulations toward an expanse, the mist still partly hid. The old woman shut the door without barring it. "Houses that keep rest are not terribly afraid of thieves," she said, as if answering a thought of his. "What is here is no use to those who come with empty hands inside." Eamon did not understand the sentence entirely, but he let it settle within him with all the other strange things the hill had already given him. They went around the house by a pale earth path bordered with low thyme and white heather. As they passed the stone circle, Eamon felt the impulse to glance through the openings, as though expecting to find something beyond them that he had not seen before. And indeed, the landscape seemed altered. The plateau that had looked small the night before now stretched a little farther, opening behind the stones into a gentle hollow, sheltered from the wind. There grew clumps of aromatic herbs, some familiar, some not. He also saw a small pool of still water, almost round, with low rushes and a surface so motionless that it reflected the mist like a sheet of unpolished silver. "It was not there last night," he murmured. "Last night you were not entirely here either." The old woman replied. They went on. The path curved between two great fallen stones, as though passing through a natural gate. When they crossed it, the air changed. It was not colder nor warmer, but deeper, fuller. Eamon felt on his skin that faint pressure that sometimes comes before rain, though the sky remained clear in its veiled way. Before them, the ground began to descend toward the other side of the hill, and then he saw it. It was not the valley of his dream. Not exactly, but something in what spread below them held that same impossible serenity, as if the two places touched each other inwardly, though they belonged to different realms. A broad hollow opened beneath them, covered in tall grass and crossed by a winding stream that shone through the mist. Here and there stood hawthorns, young ashes, and clusters of pale-barked birches. Farther away, almost dissolving into the brightness, several green rounded mounds could be seen, soft as the backs of sleeping animals. There were no houses, no smoke, no flocks, and yet the place did not feel abandoned. It felt kept. Eamon breathed in. The air on that side of the hill smelled of fresh water, early leaves, dark earth newly opened by roots, and beneath it all, very softly, of apple. His chest tightened with a calm emotion. "It is like," he said, The old woman did not ask, like what. Deep dreams sometimes leave. The door ajar for a little while, she answered. They descended the slope. There was no marked path, but the grass bent easily under their feet, and the ground was firm. At every step, Eamon felt that the world of the hill obeyed laws gentler than the rest of the earth. It did not ask for effort, only attention. They went down past birches that trembled with a very fine, almost watery sound. The stream became clearer. Wild mint and tiny white flowers identical to the one he had found beside his pillow grew near the bank. Eamon crouched. "This is the flower." The old woman nodded. "In some villages they call it April foam. In others it has no name. Plants do not consider that a misfortune." He smiled and touched the petals carefully. The stream ran clear among smooth stones, the kind that invite a person to sit nearby and forget the hour for a while. The old woman settled herself on a low rock. She gestured for him to do the same. Eamon sat opposite the water. For a time they did not speak. Silence there had a different texture from the silence of night. It was no longer a blanket. It was a soft current threaded with distant birds, with air moving through leaves, with the continual murmur of water. Eamon let those sounds wash over him. He remembered what his mother had said in the dream. When you hear water, listen well. So he listened. At first he heard only the stream. Then he began to notice distinctions. The higher tone where water narrowed between two stones, the lower whisper in a small pool, the light tapping of a twig carried by the current, a pause almost too slight to hear in an eddy where the water seemed to stop and think before moving on. And within all that, like a music hidden inside the murmur, something that was not exactly a voice, yet brought him a familiar feeling. Not words, not sentences, more like the same depth his mother's voice sometimes had when she spoke while kneading bread or mending cloth beside the fire, not expecting an immediate reply, certain that the mere continuity of her presence was enough. Eamon closed his eyes. The air smelled of apple again. Not strongly, only enough to say, "I am here." His lips trembled. He did not cry in desolation, nor in complete relief. He cried the way fields sometimes cry at the end of a drought, letting out slowly what the earth has held too long. One tear, then another. They fell over his clasped hands. The stream went on speaking in its liquid language, demanding nothing of him. The old woman did not interrupt. When at last he drew a deep breath and dried his face with the back of his hand, she said, "That is how a memory begins to widen." Eamon looked at her. "I thought healing would be something else." "Almost everyone does," she answered. "They expect bells, revelations, complete relief. But many times healing begins like this, sitting by water, accepting that it still hurts, discovering even so that pain no longer occupies the whole shore." Eamon turned his gaze back to the stream. The words felt true in a simple way, without ornament, and for that very reason, deep. They remained there much longer while the mist slowly lifted and the green mounds in the distance grew a little more distinct. At one point, a robin dropped down onto a nearby stone, tilted its head toward Eamon, and flew upstream. He followed it with his eyes until it disappeared among the birches. "I wish I could remember better," he said at last. "You will," said the old woman, "but not all at once, not by force." They returned to the house later, where she made leek and barley soup, and Eamon cut the bread. They ate slowly with long, comfortable pauses between one phrase and the next. After supper, she took up the harp again and played only a few notes, enough to make the room gentler still. That night, before sleeping, she gave him one instruction. "One thing each night," she said. "Only one. Do not force it. Let it come sit beside you." And that night, before he even lay down, he already had another. His mother bending over a pot, tasting broth with a wooden spoon and wrinkling her nose just slightly. because she always knew before anyone else whether it needed salt. He remembered it with such precision he could almost hear the little tap of the spoon against the rim. He even remembered that when the broth was right, she never said so. She only nodded once to herself, as though confirming a silent agreement with the kitchen, looked up at the old woman. "I think there will be another tomorrow," he said. She played one more note before answering. That is what true paths do. They do not end just because you stop seeing them beneath your feet. The second morning came pale and quiet. On his bed he found an apple leaf. The third morning, a short red thread tied in a small bow. Each thing called back another memory. The smell of herbs, a gesture at the table, young fruit trees marked with thread so they could be seen from afar. The old woman never seemed surprised by any of it. One morning she led him into the ring of stones where, in the center, stood a low, broad stone supporting a dark clay bowl filled with perfectly still water. "Look," she said. At first Eamon saw only the pale reflection of the sky, a branch swaying beyond the circle, and the vague shadow of his own face. Then the water seemed to settle differently. Not move, but gather itself. The reflection deepened. He did not see visions there in any loud or magical sense. He saw more quietly than that. He saw his own face as it had become under grief. He saw the tiredness in it, the years that had not yet passed but would, the life waiting beyond the hill. And he understood, without anyone saying it aloud, that rest is not a place outside life. It is something life must be taught to carry. On the day he knew he would have to leave, the morning was clearer than before. The sky was a pale white, but behind that whiteness there was a firmer shape, a more decided day. "Is it today?" he asked. "Yes," said the old woman. The word fell between them with naked kindness. No attempt to soften it, no drama, only truth. They ate well that morning, oats again, this time with chopped hazelnuts and apple cooked in honey, fresh cheese and steaming tea. Then she led him beyond the circle of stones to the rounded top of the hill where the land opened wide beneath them. From there he could see a great deal. Soft valleys, grass plains, courses of water gleaming like tin threads beneath the hidden sun. Dark patches that must be groves, ancient roads, newer paths, walls and enclosures, burial mounds barely suggested in the distance. The wind was livelier on the height, but not cold. It carried the smell of heather, high earth, and remote water. The old woman stopped beside a standing stone thinner than the others, set toward the eastern horizon. "Look carefully," she said. He did. At first he thought the last thing she had meant to show him would simply be that, the full view, the silent confirmation that the time had come to leave, and that would already have been enough. But the old woman did not speak in vain. As his gaze rested over the land, he began to see something more. The roads. Not all of them, but some. Certain paths stood out more clearly than others. Some looked plain, firm, simple. Others vanished quickly into brush or contour. And among those visible routes, for one very brief moment, Damon thought he recognized the gentle curve of a purple path crossing a distant slope. Only for a moment, then it was gone. He held his breath. "The path," he murmured. The old woman nodded. "It was not only for you. It never is. Sometimes it appears for grief, sometimes for weariness, sometimes for an old man who has walked too far, sometimes for a woman who no longer knows how to cry, sometimes for someone who has cared for others so much they forgot how to let themselves be cared for." Eamon looked farther still, though he knew he would not see it clearly again. "Then it still exists." "Of course it does. Even if I go away. True things do not depend on your looking at them." That had the firmness of a blessing. They stayed on the height a long while. At last Eamon said, "I am afraid that when I return in a few days all this will blur." The old woman turned to him. "You will not forget it. You will mix it. That is different." He frowned slightly. "I do not understand." "No true rest remains stored whole like a cup on a high shelf. It mixes with the life that continues, with your steps, with your house, with your seasons, with the way you speak to someone weary, with the way you listen to rain, with the way you sit beside a pot at the end of the day, with what you do when it hurts again, because it will hurt again sometimes." He lowered his eyes. "I know, but it will not find you without a path anymore." He thought of all the hill had given him without forcing it upon him: sleep, silence, humble food, water, music, small tasks, memory returned in pieces. A new way of looking at grief without surrendering wholly to it. And he understood that none of it would vanish all at once when he left. It would become life, mixed in, as the old woman had said. Life carried differently. "May I ask now who you are?" he said after a while. She smiled, but not as one guarding a secret out of vanity, more as one recognizing the beauty of a question that may not need a single answer. "You could ask." "Then I ask." The old woman looked over the slopes. "I have been several things, depending on who came by the path. To some, a healer, to others, a keeper, to others, only an old woman in a house on the hill. Your grandmother would have used an older word. Your mother, probably none at all." A soft shiver ran through Eamon at hearing his mother mentioned so naturally. "Did you know her?" The old woman took a moment. "I knew the kind of woman she was." She said no more, and he understood that was all he would be given. Yet it did not feel insufficient. There are things in that place that cannot be closed with the sort of certainty demanded by markets, towns, or travel accounts. They are certainties of another kind, older, less explainable. They walked back to the house without speaking. Inside, the old woman prepared a small bundle for him: bread, cheese, 2 apples, and a handful of hazelnuts wrapped in cloth. She also gave him a linen pouch containing a little dried mint and white flowers. "For the nights when your chest tightens too much," she said. Eamon took the pouch in both hands. "I will keep it. Do not only keep it, use it." A smile slipped out of him, and without saying more, she went to the chair in his little room and came back with the stream stone, the now slightly curled apple leaf, and the red thread. She set the 3 things on the table. "These are yours." Eamon looked at them for a long moment, then he took the red thread and tied it around the linen pouch. The leaf he tucked carefully into a fold of his bag so it would not break. The stone he slipped into the inner pocket of his cloak, near his chest. The old woman watched those gestures with silent approval. "That is right," she said. The afternoon had not yet come, but the light was already inclining toward a serene maturity. Eamon knew he should not delay any longer. Farewells, if dragged out too far, risk becoming a way of not walking. He slung his satchel over his shoulder, settled his cloak, put on his boots, all of it with the strange awareness that the body repeats its gestures better once the heart has accepted what is coming. When he reached the threshold, he turned back. The house was as it always had been. The low fire, the harp in its corner, herbs hanging from the beams, the clean table, the curtain to the little room standing still. Nothing extraordinary, and perhaps for that very reason, marvelous. "I do not know if I will find you again," he said. The old woman, standing by the hearth, inclined her head slightly. "If it is needed, you will know less than you think and arrive more than you planned. It usually works that way." Eamon breathed deeply. He wanted to say something better, something worthier of all he had received. But in the end, he said only the simplest truth. "Thank you." She looked at him with that still water clarity in her eyes. "Go with rest." He stepped outside. The plateau lay washed in a pale, kindly light. The ring of stones kept its silence. The air smelled of heather and something drier, as though the day were already thinking of evening. Eamon went down a few steps, and then he saw it. The purple heather path. This time it did not rise out of nowhere with the mystery of the first night. It was already there, visible, clear, stretched down the hillside like a gentle farewell. The heather seemed a little more luminous under daylight. The scent was the same, humble honey, wet earth, a trace of rain kept in the stems. Eamon smiled. "All right," he murmured without knowing exactly to whom he spoke. And he began to walk. The path descended softly, curving between rocks and low brush. Halfway down the slope, Eamon turned once to look back. The house was still there, small, white, a thin thread of smoke rising from the chimney, sheltered by the ring of stones and the rowans. The old woman was not in the doorway. There was no need. The whole hill seemed to be seeing him off in her name. He kept descending. As he went down, the outer world grew sharper. Stone walls recovered their lines. Common roads became easier to distinguish. The air lost a little of its enchanted quality and gained the kindly roughness of ordinary earth. Even so, the path remained steady beneath his feet, as if it wanted to accompany him until it was certain he could go on without it. He thought of his house, of the table, of the empty chair by the fire, of the little garden plot, of the shutters, of the kneading trough, of the blue jar of hazelnuts, of night rain coming in through a crack left just slightly open. He felt sorrow, yes, but it was no longer the lost and directionless sorrow from before. It was a sorrow with banks, a sorrow that could be held without drowning everything else. When he reached the foot of the hill, the heather path began to fade, not all at once. First it lost a little of its color, then it became less precise. Then the purple clumps blended with the rest of the field until, after a few more steps, Eamon found himself on an ordinary road bordered by grass and stone like any other. He stopped. He did not try to search for the path with his eyes. He slipped his hand into the inner pocket and touched the smooth stone. Then he brushed the little pouch tied with red thread. Then he lifted his head and looked at the clear sky. "I will not go back empty-handed," he said softly. And this time he did not say it as comfort. He said it because it was true. He set out toward the south. He walked for hours, but no longer with the same blind fatigue that had marked the previous days. Sometimes he stopped to drink from a stream or to watch the wind bend the grass in long ripples. On one of those pauses, hearing water run between two stones, he remembered effortlessly his mother's voice in the dream. "When you hear water, listen well." He smiled and listened. The murmur did not speak in words, but it returned a familiar calm. He came home. The house was empty. It hurt. Of course it hurt. The chair by the fire was empty. The folded cloths remained where he himself had left them. Her voice was not there. Her step was not there. Her hand was not there to test the broth or knock at the loaf or push the shutter just so when rain came. But the emptiness no longer struck him as a cliff with no edge. It was a room he could walk into. At first, in the evenings, he still felt his chest tighten. Then he remembered. One small thing. Only one. The unfinished song while kneading. The red thread on the young fruit trees. Hazelnuts with honey. The gesture of tasting broth. The habit of opening the window a little when it rained. The cloud of golden dust when shaking out a blanket. The knuckle against the base of the bread. The hand setting time on the table. Peas shelled at dusk. And each memory came to sit beside him, not to erase grief, but to give it a shape he could live with. As the seasons passed, Eamon began to do certain things differently. He tied red thread to a young pear tree. He hung mint to dry beside the hearth. He learned to listen to the knock of bread against its base. At times he left the shutter slightly open to hear the rain. He offered hot soup to an exhausted neighbor without asking for explanations. And one late autumn afternoon, when a young woman from the road came to his door, worn down from caring for her sick father, Eamon welcomed her in, gave her a bowl of broth, and spoke to her in a low voice without asking too much, just as he had learned in the house on the hill. He never told the whole story of the heather path, not because he wanted to keep it out of selfishness, but because some stories are spoiled if they are forced into spectacle. Sometimes, beside the fire and only among those who knew how to listen without impatience, he would mention a hill where weariness can truly rest. He would speak of an old woman who played the harp just enough for memories to come down without breaking. He would speak of a purple road that appears when it is needed. And that was enough. The years passed, not too many all at once, but in the way years pass in villages, by harvests, winters, rains, and shoots. Grief changed. It grew less sharp and deeper, more like a root than an open wound. His mother continued to be absent, but she also continued to remain, in the way he named plants, in the way he laid out a blanket by the fire for someone arriving wet, in the way he listened to wind before sleep, in the patience with which he let certain memories come of their own accord. And on some nights, when weariness began once more to tighten his chest, Eamon would open the linen pouch, rub a little dried mint and a crumbled white flower between his fingers, and the scent alone would be enough to remind him that not every road is walked outward. Sometimes he walked out to the high fields. He looked for common heather, brushed its blossoms with his hand, and let the air clear his brow. He never found the path again in quite the same way. He never clearly saw the house on the hill, nor the ring of stones, nor the old woman waiting in the doorway. But on certain evenings of great weariness, when the sun fell softly over the land and the world seemed to speak more quietly, he had the unmistakable feeling that if the need were true enough and his soul were tired enough, the road would know how to appear. And that was enough for him, because he had understood something he did not know before. Not every refuge is made to be possessed. Not every comfort exists in order to remain visible. Some appear only long enough to teach a person how to carry them afterward within. So he went on living, with good days, with heavy days, with work, with rain, with neighbors, with bread, with seasons, and within all of it, with an invisible path that from time to time flowered again, in memory like purple heather beneath the feet of someone tired. So when, many years later, a village boy, exhausted after several nights keeping watch over his little sister, once asked him whether it was true that there are roads that help a person rest, Eamon smiled, moved a pot of soup away from the fire, and answered in the calmest voice he could find, "Yes, but they are not on maps, and you do not need to go looking for them. They come when you truly need them." Then he served the boy a hot bowl, waited while he ate without hurry, and while outside the night fell over the fields with the same patience as always, he thought of a white house on a hill, of a harp resting by the hearth, and of an old woman with clear eyes who had returned to him not only rest, but the way of remembering without losing himself. And in that thought there was no tearing pain anymore, only a deep gratitude, quiet, like fire when it burns low, like rain heard from a safe bed, like earth holding the steps of those who cross it without asking anything in return. The heather path still existed, not only in hidden hills where it appears to the exhausted, also in every small gesture that gives shelter back to the world, also in every hand that offers rest, also in every memory treated with tenderness. And on the most peaceful nights, if the wind passed over the fields in a certain way and the heather only just brushed the stones of the road, It seemed possible to believe that the whole earth, for one brief moment, knew how to sing very softly for those who still needed to find the way home.